Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to the Veritas Forum and to the local organizers for inviting each of us here, especially for inviting me, the associate professor next to the Nobel laureate and the nuclear physicist. Probably the only time this will happen. I should also say I just got off the plane from giving a paper elsewhere and thought that I could come and was sure we would have podiums or something where my shoes wouldn't be quite so visible, but I apologize for to those who can see. But I'm the philosophy professor here. So
that's right.
It's the Veritas Forum, a Latin word. We heard a bit about that. There's another Latin word, scientia, which is often linked to truth in the Latin philosophical tradition. Scientia meaning knowledge, from which we get our contemporary term, of course, science. But it's a term that kind of has a lot of twists and turns throughout its history. Ian's book, he gives us, which I've been reading, he gives us a kind of nice précis of some of those historical developments. And it's now used, as you know, to refer to a certain pattern of activities that go on in labs and various other kinds of arms of a university. I don't get to count as a scientist, but these guys get to count as a scientist now, even though it used to just mean the pursuit of knowledge. And it's also taken on a certain kind of authoritative status in the university and in the broader culture. It's been very successful, obviously, technologically, as well as just in the production of knowledge. And as a result, people, I think, have been tempted to become what Ian and others will sometimes call advocates or devotees of scientism. Ian defines scientism as the belief that all valid knowledge is a product of science, of natural science. Scientism says, or at least implicitly assumes, that rational knowledge is scientific and everything else that claims the status of knowledge is just superstition, irrationality, emotion, or nonsense. That's a quotation from his book. And so I thought it would be nice, since you were both natural scientists, to start off talking about the question of scientism. What is scientism beyond this kind of very brief definition? Why has it taken hold? What are its attractions? Do people really believe that there are no sources of knowledge outside of natural science as it's currently practiced? And are you advocates of scientism?
Well, obviously, I'm not an advocate of scientism, and my book is all about why we shouldn't subscribe to scientism, as well as exploring what scientism is and trying to develop an understanding of the distinction between science and scientism. But one way of thinking about scientism is that scientism is an artificial inflation of the very real knowledge that science has about the world into a kind of what I call monopoly of knowledge. So instead of celebrating and accepting and rejoicing in the knowledge of the world that we gain through science. I'm a scientist. I think science is fantastic. I mean, I think science is one of the most powerful and successful human artifacts. And I think it gives us unprecedented knowledge about the world insofar as it behaves in a reproducible way that we call nature. But trying to take that and inflate it into all of knowledge is the error of this philosophical position that I call scientism. And that springs out of a great respect for science, for the successes of science, but it inflates that science into a place where it doesn't belong. And I think that's probably something that Roald would agree with.
Yes, I don't disagree with that. In fact, I in some way fight against scientism in science. And what I mean by that is I fight for a special place, for instance, for the kind of knowledge that chemistry provides that is not reducible to physics, for instance.
Surely this is still natural scientific knowledge.
Yes, and to people outside, chemistry looks like a hard physical science, speaking loosely, much as physics does. But there are differences. I tend to see understanding, so we're getting into philosophy, as being both vertical and horizontal. I think vertical understanding is reductionist understanding. So it is reducing biology to biochemistry and chemistry to physics. I think horizontal understanding is the way that most of the world operates, and that is understanding in answering questions that are posed of knowledge in terms of concepts which are at the same level as the questions. Now that seems quasi-circular, but I don't think it is. In the same way that the English language is circular. You look up a word and you get another word. You get another word, 6 lookups, you close the circle. That doesn't prevent people from doing precise science with that imprecise language, nor of writing beautiful poetry with it. Both are possible. So I digress on what science is, but it's important for me to say that I even within science there are scientisms which are usually reductionist in nature. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think understanding within science is often not like that.
So could you say a little bit more about, so we all agree that neither of you are scientismists. There's both scientists.
Yeah, there's no noun, is
right,
there?
Yeah, right.
For what we aren't.
Could you say more about how we go beyond scientific ways of knowing, or what that would look like?
Yeah, we all move in non-scientific ways of knowing. The love of our spouses, of our children, grandchildren, the feelings that we get in listening to music or to art, they're not going to be taken apart. Let all the extremes, scientistic sociobiologists, rest in peace. They are, or if they are so taken apart into firings of neurons that have evolved in certain ways, it'll lose all the magic of these things.
Let me jump in there. I completely agree with what you're saying, and I would echo it. But maybe that leaves us with a kind of unsatisfactory questioning. Well, if there is knowledge or something beyond science, how does that work? I think that in order to understand that, you have to understand how science works. I think what we mean by the word science today is what we've inherited from the scientific revolution. It's modern science, the way we practice it, the way Roald practices it, I practice it, and the way it's grown up into the most powerful way of finding out about the world. And science insists, the way I summarize many different characteristics of science, is that science insists on two things. It insists on reproducibility, so it insists that if you do an experiment in one place and get a certain result, that if someone else does it somewhere else at some other time, they're going to get the same result. If they don't, then there's something wrong with the science. And that also applies to observational sciences like astronomy. There have to be the possibility of reproducible observations and the understanding of reproducible phenomena. So reproducibility is one of the key things that science requires. The other key thing that it requires is a certain kind of clarity of description, so that the results, at least, of an experiment, even if not the interpretation, can be understood from one place to another. Otherwise, after all, you wouldn't be able to tell whether you'd had a reproducible experiment if you didn't crisply describe it. That clarity often means we do measurements. It very often means we do mathematics, although it doesn't, I think, require us all theories to be mathematical. But those two requirements, reproducibility and clarity, are, in my view, something which makes science have a limited scope. Science can only discover about the world insofar as it is reproducible, insofar as it is describable in these crisp and clear ways. And some of the things that Roald just remarked upon are examples of very important matters in human life, and there are others, which aren't really describable in those scientific ways, I would argue.
I would call science not a search for truth, but a search for reliable knowledge. And there's a difference. One reason I want to get away from truth is that, by making us priests of the truth, we have a long way to fall. I think some of the delight in the few cases of fraud in science, for instance, is a delight in this, that we are set ourselves up on a pedestal of supposed truth. And then there are violations. And people always have this interest in the failings of our ministers or priests or rabbis. This same thing applies to science. I would rather not set us up on a pedestal. I mean, science is curiosity, mathematicized in part. It is part of human nature. Curiosity is as old as other emergent activities of humanity, as literature and song and religion.
So it seems as though you agree that scientism is limited, both of you, and you're committed to the thought that empirical inquiry of some broader sort is, of course, productive of important kinds of knowledge, but that there might also be something beyond that.
Yes.
I agree that it seems as though, obviously, there's a certain kind of knowledge that comes just through everyday experience and empirical kinds of inquiry that don't count as full-blown science. But I'm interested if we can push you both a little bit beyond the empirical to say something about whether you think, say, speculative metaphysics is something that is productive of knowledge, or something like, I mean, you referred to aesthetic experiences, something ineffable. So I don't know.
Well, let me jump in and push it a little away from the speculative,
Okay.
More towards the definite. I mean, I think if you think about history, I think history is the classic example of an important area of human knowledge, vitally important area of human knowledge, which is not, by and large, scientific. I mean, I don't mean to say that science couldn't add a little bit to some historical endeavors and studies and so forth, but by and large, what history studies are the unique events of the past. You can't go back and do an experiment to find out whether some event of history happened the way you think it did and all the causes were what you thought they were. And yet history is tremendously important. And history has real knowledge.
But it's empirical still.
Well, I think it's probably unhelpful to label it empirical. Because I think empirical tends to lean towards people thinking that you can do experiments, okay, which you can't.
Yeah, and it's not empirical. Another way, I think this empirical stuff, the data is mute. Data says nothing. It takes a human being and a theoretical framework, a framework of understanding to make sense of anything. I think it's the same in history. If we could put a camera in a past that could observe some moment that we don't know about, that moment by itself is just what it is, a photograph, an observation. One has to put it in the context of the human beings and their actions. I think history is a very creative part of the humanities.
Absolutely, and that's sort of that's a theme that I'm trying to bring out in my book, which is to say that disciplines like history are tremendously important. They have real knowledge that is definitely knowledge. They have important ways of obtaining that knowledge, in other words, epistemology. But that epistemology is not the same as the natural sciences. And to try to turn history into a science in the mold of the natural sciences is just a dreadful mistake, and that's what I call scientism. And that scientism, unfortunately, has, over the centuries, actually been quite influential in history and other disciplines. You know, I'm not saying that all historians adopt it, but I think there is a sense in which there's a temptation for us to adopt it because science has been so tremendously successful and has a terrific brand image. And there's a tendency for us all to think, well, science is where the real goods are. And I don't think that's true. I think historians have real knowledge. I think their disciplines are terribly important. I think the same is true of economists, sociologists, political scientists. Yeah. See, that's the problem. Science once used to mean just all the real systematic knowledge there is. Yeah. But that isn't what it means today. But there are echoes of that past meaning in some of the disciplines we talk about.
You're not going to go for metaphysics.
We can get to metaphysics. Okay. I'd be happy to get to it. But I wanted to talk about some of these others first. And the reason why I want to do that is because very often this discussion ends up being science versus religion.
Right.
And I don't think the discussion is science versus religion. I think the really tense and difficult discussion is between scientism, which is not science, it's the artificial elevation of science to a monopoly of knowledge, and all the other disciplines, not just religion, but all the other disciplines.
When do you think first scientism came to be into Western culture? Newton?
That again, you got to read the book. But sorry. Actually, in fairness, Roald has read the book to some extent.
Yes,
It came into place rather slowly and steadily. There were signs of it in the scientific revolution itself, in the 17th century, but it really got going solidly in the 18th century and was part very much of an Enlightenment attempt to undermine, actually, some of the metaphysical authority of the church. And so certainly in France, for example, the philosophers wielded science, turned into a kind of scientism, as one of the weapons with which they were trying to tear down the church as part of what went on in French philosophy during that time. Don't you think that's true?
Yeah, I think so. And the cult of Newton that arose about mechanistic explanations, which pervaded the sort of then view, coupled to the development of mathematics. Do you think it did harm in the beginning?
Scientism, yes, I think scientism probably did do quite a bit of harm. I mean, we can discuss whether the Enlightenment was a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I think most people in universities today think that there was a lot of good in it as well as harm. And so, good or bad, I'm not sure what the way to answer that would be.
Well, let me say something in a provocative way. I also don't like scientism, but I think you're setting up a straw man or a straw woman. Doesn't matter. You're setting up something to fight against, and why are you doing that? Is it just because you don't like the Dawkins books?
I've been saying this since long before Dawkins wrote
Right.
The God Delusion and so forth. So the quick answer to that is no. I certainly don't think that I'm setting up a straw man. I put forward in my book a strong view of how important this discussion is, of how widespread scientism is. And even though I recognize that really it's completely impossible to live out your life consistently adopting a scientific position. I mean, of course, we all know things personally. We have personal knowledge that doesn't come from science. And in fact, you can't even practice science itself without taking advantage of all of the practical and personal knowledges that you've gained, through your education and through your development, that aren't science at all. So, of course, in a certain sense, if you think about it carefully, you realize that phrased in that bleak and simplistic way, in the science is all the real knowledge there is, it can't possibly be true, okay? So that's one reaction to the thesis that scientism is important. And yet, as you and I were just discussing earlier today, you know, there are people coming out, like Alan Rosenberg, the philosopher, who will directly espouse it. They'll say, yes, scientism is true, it's what we have to deal with. Everything we see is just going to be described by science. The physical world is all there is, and you better live with it.
Yeah, but I see
Most of the time, it's somewhere much more
Well, what does
implicit.
it matter? And also, I think if you look in their lives, they're going to concerts, they're looking at art.
Right.
They're,
So I think
they're
yeah.
even some of them are religious.
I think we'd have to look at that particular book and see what he meant by scientism. Yeah. But my sense is I'm tempted to think that there's a little bit of a straw man here too, just because if history doesn't count as scientific for a scientist, scientismist, then it's not clear that there are going to be many people at all.
On the contrary, you're misunderstanding. My argument is that scientism attempts to take history and do history using methods that are paralleling those of the natural sciences. And so you get historians like Edward Cheney, who was the president of the American Historical Society in the beginning of or the first quarter of the 20th century, who would talk about laws of history as definite as the laws of gravity.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
And that's an example of scientism. It's an example of a desire to turn the perfectly valid humanities into something more like science, because science is the knowledge with prestige. You know, you can think of lots of other historical examples. If you think about the positivists of the first half of the 19th century, here were people, Auguste Comte as the founder of positivism, who considered that all knowledge must pass through the law of three stages, making a progression from the fictitious through the metaphysical to the positive. And of course, positive knowledge is the type of knowledge, he says, that we get from science. And Comte himself thought that he was going to be the person that guided sociology from its fictitious stage, which he also called the religious stage, through its metaphysical stage to its positive stage. Now, of course, that ended up being very fruitless, although on the way it spawned lots of other ideas. So I'm arguing that kind of scientistic approach is very fruitless, and yet it exists and is alive today. Not often acknowledged. People don't get up and say, yeah, I believe in scientism. They almost never do. Rosenberg is rare in that sense. Yeah. So in that sense, yes, I agree, that's very rare. Well, but nevertheless, the impulse is still there.
Let me just try
it hasn't had no effect on more than half of the American people who don't believe that kind of stuff.
Good.
So let me just try to reframe it again to push in the direction where I think we'd like to go, which is maybe there are some advocates of scientism of some sort, though I think even, at least in philosophy, positivism is a completely dead program.
Absolutely.
So, but I think that what most people think when we say, I want to be guided by scientific approaches or knowledge or something like that, is something a bit more vague, something like, I think empirical or sense-perceptual sorts of things are the things that really give us knowledge. Of course, there's math and there's logic and analytic truths. We'll have to say something about that. But beyond that, there should be empirical data involved, though, of course, there's more than just empirical data. And it's when people go beyond the constraints of possible experience that we start getting these speculative flights of fancy and religious enthusiasms and superstitions. That's the kind of going beyond the finite that I think people still would want to resist on the basis of something like empiricism, if you want, rather than scientism.
You think of religion as superstition, do you?
No. I'm just saying I think there will be a position according to which anything that goes beyond something we could all possibly experience is superstition.
Well, that's the reason why I somewhat resisted your using the phrase empiricism.
Okay. Because
you're quite right. I mean, there are one viewpoint is that there are two ways to go about living your life or deciding the facts. One is empiricism, and the other is faith, okay? And the faith heads, just basically believe whatever they're told,
Right.
or whatever their religious authorities believe. And we, smart empiricists,
Right.
we have empirical knowledge, okay? I think this is complete fallacy. That it just isn't like that, okay? In the first place, I'm a Christian. I believe in God. I try to follow Jesus Christ. I do so in part because I think there's evidence for it, okay?
Empirical?
So, well, again, you're pressing me on this empirical thing. I just don't think that that's a helpful word. I think there's evidence. I think in the case of Christianity, a lot of that evidence is not scientific. It's historical. It's personal. It's documentary. It's various types of evidences which are not scientific evidence. And so those people who set up scientism as the way to go about things, who think that science is really all the knowledge, discount that kind of evidence, but I think erroneously discount that kind of evidence. And they insist, well, where's your scientific evidence for your religious beliefs? I would say it's a mistake to think religious beliefs should be tested by scientific evidence. Science can say something about religious beliefs, and religion and science can be mutually correcting. But I think in general, if you believe there's evidence for religion, for particular religious beliefs, that sort of evidence is likely, by and large, not to be scientific evidence.
Yeah, I quite agree. I think just the statement, is there evidence for the existence of God, puts the question into a scientific mode of expression. Or it asks for the word evidence then somehow takes on the cast of the being scientific evidence. I don't think that's a legitimate question.
Are there reasons? Are there grounds for belief in something beyond the finite?
I think so.
So it's not evidence, but there's
I think
reasons or grounds.
I happen to think it's human emergent activity. I mean, that it's a creation of human beings.
So say something more about that. That's interesting.
Well, yes, I will. I will say something.
Okay, yeah.
So I think what's wrong with what Weinberg or Dawkins or the mass of modern anti-religious fundamentalists with their statement that religion is superstition. What's wrong with it is they have failed in the most basic activity of scientists, which is to observe. And I, with the help of history and books, observe that every culture in the world, from the one that we have called primitive, and from the first peoples to the pseudo-sophisticated, sophisticated cultures that we have, every culture has a need for religion of some sort. And I just see it. And no one, they came to it intuitively out of being human. I think it's an emergent human activity to think, a part of developing consciousness, to think about our origins, to think about cosmologies, to think about, is there order in a universe, in a chaotic world? I think religion is absolutely natural.
But why isn't this just susceptible to Freudian, Marxian, Nietzschean critique that would say, of course, humanity needs these various things. They need to feel comfort in the face of all of these dangerous weather episodes or whatever. And so they develop these beliefs. But
so
that's not
they develop
evidence.
it from Marxists, they develop it from a psychobiological perspective, that we need this, but it's there. It's there as much as curiosity and humor and love and artistic expression is there. But I think it's there, and here is where I differ from the people of my own monotheistic background, and let's blame the Jews for that. That's where I come from. No one else to blame. I think this is an human creation. Because the other part of observing the variety of religious experiences that have arisen in this world out there is that they all take different formats. The natural ones, the ones that have... And that convinces me there is no God. You asked me for my view.
Yeah.
Because I see gods. I think the Greeks and Japanese native religions, Shinto, and all primitive religions got it closer. I think there are gods. There are ways that human beings interact with each other, with the nature that is around us, and it is natural to impute powers and control and origins. If there were one God, surely he would have made it easier for human beings to agree that there is one.
So can I take that up a little bit? So clearly the religious impulse is almost universal amongst humans.
That's right.
I mean, that's really what Roald is saying. And for people who do believe in God, that's not a problem. I mean, that's just what you would... I mean, we would say that's just what you would expect if there really is a God. So, I mean, that leaves us in a situation where it doesn't sort of explain it one way or it doesn't explain it the other way. It's simply a fact of human nature that there is this impulse to religion.
Though, as he says, you would expect that God would make it such that we all believe in more or less the same one.
Well, is that the case? I mean, is that obvious? I mean, what Christians say is that God has progressively revealed himself, okay? And so it's not that this innate human impulse, religious impulse, is completely, monotheistic or has some, universal clarity, pinpoint precision. Clearly, it's something extremely vague. And Christians would say, as would Jews for that matter, God has revealed himself progressively over history, through individuals, through peoples, through movements, through churches, etc. And that there is a development of that. It's interesting. Again, this argument can go both ways. Roald says he thinks that the differences amongst religions are an argument for there being no religion, but I don't see how that kind of follows. I mean, if all religions were pretty much the same, would that somehow be more persuasive? It's not so obvious to me why that was.
I'm not arguing against there being no religion. I find my spiritual fulfillment in other things. I think I'm just arguing that there is a multiplicity of religion, and that leaves me thinking that there is no one path, Christian or Jewish or anything else.
Maybe I can turn the discussion a little bit to something that's related, which is the question or topic of a worldview. This is a phrase, it actually comes out of the German tradition that I work in, Weltanschauung, which then gets picked up in the 19th and 20th century by various different groups and has often kind of been part of a relativistic picture in the past. The thought would be, well, we all have our different view on the world or conceptual scheme. We get it out of culture or history or background or family or language or something like that. And that means that the way the world appears to us, or the way maybe the religious entity appears to us, will be different, will be shaped by those concepts and backgrounds and cultures. Interestingly, it seems as though Christians and people in kind of campus ministry contexts and so forth talk a lot these days about worldviews and seem to think that that notion has an important role to play in discourses that are a little more optimistic about truth and our ability to access it. So I'm curious whether you think that some appeal to worldviews might explain why, if there is one God, it appears to different cultures and histories in different ways. And whether you find the notion of a worldview to be a helpful one in these kinds of discussions.
I think sometimes about my worldview. It changes from time to time. It is clearly shaped, as it is for all of us, by our history. And part of my worldview is, and it's incredible that it can come from having been a survivor of the Holocaust, that I'm the last generation of Hitler's gifts to America. I continue to see the good in people. And so I see in this beautiful and terrible world, I accept both. And I struggle very hard for what would be, in other terms, expressed as, I struggle very hard against giving good and evil equal balance, against being a Manichaean. I don't mean that badly, because that is a persuasion that some people have. I just naturally, and it amazes me that it comes from the background that I have, I see more of the good than I see of the bad in people. And then, like anyone else, we try to do the best that we can in a world where everything is pulled and we're saying yes to one person, it means saying no to another. And things are difficult. The worldview I have does not encompass a religious entity, yet I feel spiritual. The contact with the spiritual is made largely through literature and the arts for me. And it is not made through religion. I have, in some sense, tried it. It doesn't work for me. Nevertheless, I believe, and I'm not in a self-justificatory mode, that it's possible to be ethical and a good human being without what I would call the crutch of religion. I think it's possible to do good.
Can I just clarify before, when you say you tried it and it didn't work, does that mean some of these experiences, evil and so forth, made it such that you just couldn't go through these kind of religious practices? Or
the religious practices, each one of them, it was as simple as being forced for a year before a bar mitzvah that these socialist Jewish parents made me go through anyway. That year was just entirely the wrong instruction. If I had been the teacher, I would have known what to do to keep me religious. And that teacher didn't do it. Later on, I wrote a book about science and Jewish religious tradition, so I can't get away from this in some way. And I read much more of the religious text than I had ever before in my life. And even though I have great feeling for those texts, I can see how those people think. Those people are religious Jews. I cannot put myself into them. Actually, the only way I can get in is through ritual. The ritual means something.
Okay. So this question of worldview, everybody lives their lives in some way or another. Those of us who are thoughtful about it, I don't think everybody has a worldview. I think some people just simply haven't thought about it, okay? I mean, they simply just, live by the moment, and that's, whatever feels good, do it, type of thing. So I don't think everybody has a worldview. But I think thoughtful people, and probably that means most of the people in this room, sooner or later are going to have some sets of principles by which they live their lives. Those sets of principles are not going to be things that science has told them, even if they're scientists. Even if their faith is in science. It isn't science that's told them to put their faith in science. Okay? So all of us are going to be in a position where we're going to adopt some set of principles by which we live our lives, and those amount to our worldview. That worldview may include some kind of justifying narrative history, okay? Whether it's a myth or whether it's an actual history. That worldview might include a cosmology, a description of how the world really is, how the universe really is, and maybe why it is. That worldview quite likely will lead that person even into some kind of community of similarly minded people. And that community and that person will look to their worldview to answer ethical questions, to give them ethical guidance. Now, all of those things, are things which purport also apply to religion. Okay? And the only thing that's missing from it that a secular person might object to, if I were to call their worldview a religion, is, there is no supernatural. Okay? And that's the only difference. But of course, there are plenty of religions that actually don't appeal to the supernatural. So in a certain sense, what you're saying when you're talking about a religion is you're politely telling people that they have unproven assumptions which have all those characteristics that I just said, and they're the way that they live their lives. And you're politely telling them they have a religion. Okay? That's fine. I have no problem with that. I think most thoughtful people do. I think Rawls, advocated his, and I wouldn't deny it or confront it. I just say that I think that for people like me, who believe that there is a God and that God has been revealed through the person of Jesus Christ, we look to the teachings of Christ, to his actions on our behalf as the foundation of our worldview, if you like. And what's more, we claim a little bit more than that. We say that it's possible to have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And so, in a certain sense, Christianity is a worldview, but in a certain sense it claims to be, I would claim it to be, more than that. It claims to be a relationship, more than just simply a set of ideas and principles.
Well, doesn't it also claim to be the true worldview in some sense?
Oh,
and
absolutely.
Doesn't that upset all the members of other worldviews?
Well, yeah, I suppose it does.
Yeah. It's okay.
The same way that their claims upset me.
Right.
But this is one of the troubles that I have about discussion in the public square and in the academy today is there's this kind of presumption that somehow if you have convictions, you must somehow leave them behind at home before you step out into the public square. I think pluralism is a very good thing. I think mutual respect of individuals' opinions and positions is extremely important. But I don't think it should be necessary to leave behind your convictions in order to go and have a sensible and open discussion with someone. So I wouldn't expect Roald to have to leave his convictions behind, whatever they might be, to come and talk to us here, and I wouldn't expect myself to have to do the same thing. So I think it's a mistake for us to set out to be offended every time someone makes any kind of claim about their thing. That's not
I
the
think
right approach.
the interesting thing is that the problem arises that when a certain religious worldview or persuasion or a
Or secular.
Or secular, or scientistic even, impinges on another sphere of our interactions with each other, which is the social contract that we have as it is, I don't want to say the U.S. Constitution, God forbid, but as it is as it comes to life in the form of government we have. And when there is a place for science in government, there is a place for a DNA test in a court of law. But when I think in the ways that people have found of killing other people, thinking that you're right scientifically is, I'd rather not have the world run by scientists. I think they will kill people because they think other people were wrong. And I don't want a world run by Christians. What I mean is that the government, our Constitution, in fact, is a very interesting document, crafted out of that tension between Christianity and a Republican ideal. But I think that's where we get in trouble, when these things impinge on law and social contract.
Let me come back on that.
Sure.
I think it's, of course, completely impossible for science or religion, for that matter, not to impinge upon society in a certain way. I think you and I both agree that there are grave dangers when either scientism or some fundamentalist view of any sort imposes its will on society. The difficulty, though, with that is that we can say that with a clear conscience in our society, but I could think of lots of other societies that have existed in the previous century or even exist today, where actually people are already under oppression, and the question is, how do you survive under that oppression? I think actually, one of the unique aspects of Christianity is that it grew up not as the state religion, but actually as a faith that was passed on by word of mouth, yes, from very intelligent people, but also to the common folk, the slaves, the oppressed. And in fact, Jesus' teachings themselves are very much focused on recognizing the importance of remembering the little people and sustaining and ministering to them. And so that's one of, I think, the appeals of Christianity as a belief, and it's one of the strengths of Christianity that it brings to this discussion the kinds of view of society that these days we take for granted. So in America or in Europe, we take for granted a certain view of what is right, what is good, what is the good life, and so on and so forth, much of which is actually inherited from Christianity. If we didn't inherit it from Christianity, it's not so clear. We would have inherited what we currently believe as being right moral principles.
There was a lot of good stuff in Athens, too, I have to say.
Good show.
Okay. Any final texts should be sent now, and let me maybe just invite you to come up as we're discussing this last question, but I wanted to return to something that you gestured at and sort of bring it into a question that maybe Ian can also engage with, namely experiences that are of the non-finite in some way. So you've edited a book and written about the Sublime, also for sale in the back, apparently.
Yes.
Shameless.
Right.
Thank you, Andrew.
The Sublime being a kind of aesthetic experience
Yes.
that is often analogized to religious experience. And for people who no longer feel religion is available to them, they'll be very interested in these kinds of aesthetic experiences. And it sounded like that might be your kind
So
of...
the Sublime always interested me, a concept in art, sometimes relegated to discussing romanticism, but also having very much to do with your Kant, and then cast into a psychological realm before Kant and recast by Lyotard in a postmodern context. But scientists don't want to talk about the sublime by and large. I think it's a mistake. The sublime being something which is more beautiful than you can imagine, more powerful, more stronger than that. And somehow to scientists, so think Hubble telescope images. To scientists, or think the ribosome. To scientists, it looks like religion sneaking in the back door. To some scientists, and it's such a mistake, because why not accept that there is something special about what you have, what you see for the first time. That you see it hasn't been on Earth before. A molecule, it can be other things. You see it, and it's beautiful, and there's no way you may not describe it well. You don't have the words to describe it yet. It is sublime. You're not going to tell any lies about it. You may not describe it well, but it's beautiful. And why not admit in that that it also, seeing that it's beautiful, brings you in communion, loosely speaking, with other people who admire that object. I wouldn't want science to lose that sense of wonder.
So how does it relate to religious experience?
Yeah, okay. I think that the experience of the sublime is very much something that many scientists, whether they're religious believers or not, would identify with. And I completely endorse what you say. I think this is one of the more troubling things about the modern relationship between science and the Christian faith and other religious faiths, is that this wedge that scientism tends to drive between science and religion separates what was once together. The scientists of the scientific revolution, by and large, were religious believers. Kepler remarked that he was thinking God's thoughts after him. That was the attitude that he had. And that was his expression of seeing the sublime in his studies of nature and relating it to his religious faith. And that's something that I feel I could also identify with, not that I'm a Kepler or anything like it, but I think in small ways, we as religious believers within science can also see that nature, that book of nature, as a revelation of God in a meaningful sense. And that's why I'm so distressed when I see this artificial wedge being driven between science and religious faith, because I think it has no place. And I think that, to me, the experience of the sublime that I have in my profession is not entirely different from the experience of God that I have in worship. And I think these two things are related. They're not so different.
Great. So I think we've had a great setup here, and it's really interesting to hear now from the audience. Okay, I guess I will just ask question number 1 here, and then look through the rest and see what they look like. So what would it require for Dr. Hoffmann or Dr. Hutchinson to change their theistic or atheistic positions to the opposite? A sublime experience.
Well, if you like, I'll jump in. I mean, is there any order to this?
No.
No.
You know, I am sometimes asked this question, and the answer I give is this. If, I don't know how this would happen, but if it was somehow shown beyond question that Jesus did not rise from the dead on the third day, then I think Christians, like me, would be in the position of having been shown that our religious beliefs were based on something which is incorrect. And so that would be sufficient to discourage me or convince me that I was mistaken. And that's actually, by the way, the sense in which I think Christianity is in part dependent on evidence. It's not scientific evidence by and large, but it is historic evidence.
So in my case, since my conviction that there is no God is fundamentally an unscientific conviction, it would take a real conversion experience of some sort, some sign.
Okay.
It would nothing to do with science.
Would it have to be empirical? Would you have to sense perceive it?
I don't know. It might be mystical, it might be empirical. But,
Okay. But the sublime won't do it. That you'll always interpret as something non.
Yeah, I'll still interpret it.
Okay. I guess this is going to be for you, Ian. Given that it is impossible to prove the existence of supernatural entities and forces, which by definition includes God, how can anyone logically argue for and have any belief in the existence of a particular supernatural entity such as Zeus, Jesus, or Ra?
Well, I don't accept the premise. I don't accept the premise that it is impossible to have evidence or have reasons to believe in God. I think there are lots of reasons to believe in God. I think there are at least 5 different types of reasons, each of which has many reasons under it. And maybe I oughtn't to take all the time to go into those. Yeah. But I mean, so fundamentally my answer is I think it's an incorrect premise. I think there is good reason to believe that God exists, and that I have good reasons for my faith.
And these are the historical as well as religious experience.
Okay, he's going to make me do
no,
it.
Yes,
Okay.
Just the categories.
The
not
categories.
The details, yeah.
Arguments. So these are philosophical arguments.
Okay.
Evidences. These are things like history and so forth.
Okay.
Immediate personal experience. There are other evidences that are a form of organization, so that in a certain sense religion or God makes sense of the world. And finally, although these may not be very good reasons, utility. It's actually good to believe God. So those are 5 different types of reasons. And by the way, A, E, I, O, U, that's the way to remember it. Okay?
But here's a question that's...
I made that up.
Here's a question that's related. Why wouldn't something like that be reproducible? So if you think you've had various personal experiences and various evidences that you can cite, why isn't it the sort of thing that if someone were to try really hard and maybe pray and so forth, it wouldn't happen to them?
Well, I mean, that's like asking, why shouldn't we have a scientific test for being in love? Okay? Well, I don't think it's a very sensible way to go about personal relationships. Let's leave it at that.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Do you want to say anything about this question? On the question of whether to believe or not believe in a God or gods, where do you see the burden of proof lying? Maybe start with you, Roald.
Oh, I don't know what the question is. I think the question is...
what should be our default position, I think?
Well, my default position, based on my sort of background and worldview, is going to be different from that of other people. But my default position is that human beings have evolved to a degree of complexity where we are more than just the firing of neurons in us and the biochemical actions. There is something known as consciousness, and there are emergent properties of human beings of which science and religion are both manifestations. That's my fallback position.
I agree with that. And I would say actually it's probably wrong to think there ought to be a default position. Why ought there to be a default position? I mean, surely we use our intelligence and our knowledge and our experience to try to make sense of the world around about us. And it shouldn't be the default that we only believe in things that can be measured and have reproducible scientific properties. Because lots of our life just simply isn't that way. Our friends are not people that we test through science. We can't discover the justice of a verdict by some means of science. So it's crazy to build up science or to be the default way of finding out about things. And I don't think there should be a default. We just are doing our darndest to understand the world. And I think we should use all of our experience to do that, personal or impersonal.
Here's a question from someone who may be a devotee of scientism, and it's for you. Dr. Hoffmann mentioned that it would be sad if appreciation of art could be reduced to the firing patterns of neurons. Why would it be sad, given that it's true? Might not some good come of it?
Yeah, a typical reductionist thinking. I mean, you just, you take the thing apart and you understand it in pieces, and then with a little bit of chance thrown in, going upscale now, you will reconstruct the world. Well, I have a lot of experience dealing with reductionists, and I've seen precious few people move upscale. They only want to take things apart, and it's usually an excuse for trying, for not working on what they're supposed to be working on. And so I think that synthesize, that's why I like chemistry, we make molecules. We synthesize things, and that we are close to art, unless we, and since, not to get too uppity about it, we're also close to engineering. We make the things we make work and have effects and have ethical consequences. I think that the world is so interesting that we make out of things, and making things, moving upscale, using chance as it comes, that's what human creativity is. And that kind of taking it apart into neuron action is not going, it's going to get you a lot of Nobel Prizes, but it's not going to make any art.
I don't think, okay. Here's a question that's sort of after my own heart. In a science such as cosmology, where we do not have a laboratory, where the idea of reproducibility does fail, might philosophical considerations and metaphysics take up some of the slack?
Yeah, I was asked last weekend in the context of a debate on this topic about this kind of question. And the question was put, is cosmology a science? This came from a cosmologist. Mm-hmm. So I had to be careful. And my answer was sometimes. Sometimes it is. There's lots of things we know about the universe that are very well established by science. Those are the things that we can make reproducible observations of. For example, we know that the universe is expanding at a rate which it would be expanding at if it had been altogether in a very small region 13.7 billion years ago, and that's called the Big Bang, of course, because we can measure those receding velocities very, very carefully, very, very accurately, using science and many different observations. So astronomy, which is an observational science, is very much dependent upon reproducibility. In fact, that's one of the reasons why astronomy was the first science in a certain sense, historically speaking, is because we looked up into the heavens and we saw these very complex but still reproducible variations. But the flip side is there's a lot of speculation in cosmology. I'm not a cosmologist, but there is a lot of speculation in cosmology. And it's very hard, of course, for the layperson to distinguish between what is speculation and what is established fact. And actually, it was a few years ago, but Burton Richter, who's sort of grand old man, a statesman of high-energy particle physics, made a remark in Physics Today, which is the monthly magazine of the American Physical Society, that to him, a lot of what passed for the latest in particle and high-energy physics theory associated with cosmology sounded more like theology than it did like science. In other words, he was saying that for his taste, there was a lot too much speculation. So that's the reason why I answered sometimes.
Do Do you want to say
No.
something? Oh, okay.
Not really.
What do you think about the following quotation? There are two ways to live your life. You can live as though nothing is a miracle, or you can live as though everything is a miracle. And if you can tell me who said that, I'll give you a bonus. Einstein.
Einstein said that. Einstein was very good at saying such things. Well, it's related somewhat to my optimism about human being. It's related to seeing cups half full or half empty. I think the world is miraculous. On an everyday, mundane perspective, we just stop to look at it outside, the trees in bloom.
You mean the laws of nature are being broken? No.
No.
That
All
would
depends
be
what you mean, right?
A miracle, right? Yeah.
No. So I'm using miracle not as a real miracle.
Okay.
Maybe Ian has
So let me. Okay, I agree with the spirit of what you said. That I think when we say it's a miracle, what we're very often saying is this is spectacularly wonderful,
right,
and I'm very thankful for it. And that's a kind of and I think that would be what you were using.
Yes.
You were using to me, and I do think that's an impulse that very often many people feel. Maybe everyone at some time feels that. Isn't that wonderful? And I'm very thankful for it. And I think that's probably what Einstein meant when he made that aphorism.
Right, he was a determinist, of course.
He didn't believe in a personal God, as far as I can tell, but he certainly spoke frequently about God and had what I would think of as being a religious or spiritual perspective on creation. On the other hand, the other meaning of miracle is a spectacular work of God, very often contrary to the normal course of events in the world, by which God shows his power and people on earth come to believe in him. In that sense, I think that aphorism would be completely wrong. I think that as far as I'm concerned, we're in an intermediate stage. That most of the things that go on in the universe are actually going on in accordance with what we call the laws of physics or the laws of nature. And some people think that those laws are inviolable. They can never be broken, okay? But some people think, and I'm one of them, that there's nothing inherent about the laws of nature that means they can't be broken. But I don't think they're broken on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And so I don't go all the way to the other side and say everything is a miracle. But what I do say, coming back to my original comment, which is that when I say, isn't the world wonderful, and isn't everything in a certain sense round us that we see in nature, in the people we meet, in the blessings we receive, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that a miracle? I say, yes, in a certain sense it is a miracle. I receive it as a gift from God, and I'm thankful to God for it.
Let me just follow up on that really quickly, this miracles question, because it's surprising to hear, I think for many people, that a physicist would be open to the thought that once in a while the laws of physics are somehow broken by divine fiat. So it seems as though many, even past religious philosophers, some of the people I work on, Leibniz and company, didn't want to say that and thought that it was very dangerous for science to allow that the laws are at all violable. Do you feel concerned at all about the scientific project, given that you think sometimes the laws don't hold?
Well, first of all, I think Leibniz was to a certain degree in a minority amongst the scientists of the scientific revolution, because the fact of the matter is that most of the scientists who founded modern science were in fact religious believers and accepted the possibility of miracles. None of them had a problem. They might have had a worry, but fundamentally they decided that somehow this would make sense. Newton himself, for example, invoked God's miracles to keep the planets in order. So he certainly didn't think that the laws of nature were inviolable. So when people tell me that you can't be a good scientist unless you think the laws of physics are inviolable, I simply refer them to the people who invented science, okay?
Yeah. But where would your reproducibility be if miracles were there?
Of course, science describes the normal course of events. Okay? It describes the world insofar as it is reproducible and does follow the laws of physics. But the fact that the world does follow these laws remarkably well doesn't prove that they are themselves inviolable. I mean, the Christian perspective on this is to say that God upholds the universe by his word of power. So a biblical perspective on this is not to say that somehow, God set the world going and then went on vacation, or he set the world going and occasionally allows himself to reach in and touch something, okay, and change something. What it says is he sustains it by his word of power. You and I would not be here were it not for the will of God that sustains the whole universe. And I think if you take that perspective, why would one have supposed that God was prevented from acting in his own will? Yes, the laws of nature describe the faithfulness, the consistency of God in his action in upholding the universe, but they do not forbid him from acting in other ways.
So is this, feel free to decline to answer if you'd prefer, but is this a merely theoretical doctrine for you, or would you take yourself to have experienced miracles?
Certainly, I would say I've experienced a miracle on occasions.
Okay. And you would say I've experienced the world as miraculous.
Yes.
But it's not a violation of the scientific law.
No, I don't think so.
Right. Let me go to this one. Is science considered trustworthy only on a pragmatic basis? Is science only valuable because it works?
I would say yes. That's what I meant by reliable knowledge. Okay. And so it's perhaps given greater strength to the criterion of reproducibility that Ian has forwarded. I think it is pragmatic knowledge. Therefore, it's very interesting how standards of proof in science are different from standards of proof in the law, sometimes coinciding, sometimes not. They have different reasons for being in our society. Yeah, I think science depends on its pragmatic value, and that, of course, is that pragmatic value can be misused by human beings and technology.
Does it work because it gets us the truth? Isn't that just the more fundamental reason?
I don't know about the truth. Truth is, you saw that. You see Plato in the Raphael painting. He's pointing up there. That's where the truth is. And Aristotle is pointing down here. Right. That's where the earth is. I think Aristotle, much maligned for leading physics astray for 2,000 years, Aristotle was a careful observer of nature. In his Animalia, he describes snails that generate the color indigo, purple, the Tyrian purple, in enough detail that any modern biologist can find those snails. He's a careful observer of nature.
So observe, report, but don't ask these bigger questions about truth.
Oh, not about truth, but he asked bigger questions about physics, and some of them he got right and some wrong.
While not disagreeing directly with that, I have a slightly different slant on it. First of all, I think clearly science is pragmatic. And so when Francis Bacon famously referred to science as being for the relief of man's estate, what he was saying, this is from the early 17th century, what he was saying is that science ought to have useful applications. And certainly that's been one of the driving factors behind modern science as we know it, that it has applications. And in fact, scientific knowledge, the knowledge of the reproducible, is precisely the type of knowledge that you need in order to do technology, in order to do engineering. But I do think that I, and probably a large fraction of the scientific community, tend to have a philosophically realist viewpoint. Perhaps a critical realism. We adopt sort of critical realism, but we're not. We generally think. What I mean by that is we generally think there really is a world out there, and that science is really, in some respects, describing it. Okay, and I think that would be a view that would be shared by most scientists. So it's not purely pragmatic in that sense.
Right. Okay. I think we're coming to the end here, so there's just one more question. It's addressed to you, but I think we can make it a joint question. Ian, must have come from a professor, I'm sure. Ian,
It's fine.
what makes you choose Christianity in particular as opposed to, say, Shintoism as a useful mode of understanding? And I think we could open it up by asking you, what makes you choose some combination of the Sublime and maybe a secular Judaism and so forth as the mode of understanding that you find to be most useful?
Yeah, okay. I think that for some people, they come to a religious conviction perhaps by some kind of philosophical argument that persuades them that God exists, and then they realize that there are certain special types of religion that appeal to them better, and then that's what happens. That is not how I became a Christian. I became a Christian because I was convinced, in the end, that Jesus is who he says he is, and that Christianity makes sense of the world in a way that I find persuasive. So that's why, in a certain sense, I've kind of shied away from, the notion that there is no evidence. I think there is a way of approaching the claims of Christianity, which is not rationalistic, but it's not irrational. Okay, faith eventually has to be exercised. We're not going to have a blanket proof one way or the other, and we're in the end going to have to live our lives on the basis of incomplete knowledge. But for me, it was never really anything other than my faith in Jesus that led me to be a religious believer. So in a certain sense, the question is very straightforward to me. Christianity just seems to be by far the most persuasive.
The most plausible.
Most plausible.
Mm-hmm. So I came to what I might call secular humanism, with a role for understanding in terms of science, and with a belief that art, especially literature, have an equal place with science. I came to it through college. And what I mean by that is, at Columbia, where as an undergraduate, there was a core curriculum of humanities and contemporary civilization in which we read these great works of humanity. And then I took some further courses, wonderful courses in Japanese literature and poetry, and the world opened up to me. And the world that opened up was, the science courses were boring, in fact. But I remained in science through summer research experiences, but the world that opened up was actually a world mostly outside of science. And it was the world of the spirit. It was largely devoid of religion, though I had to work myself into the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas, because I had to read that material and understand that. But the world opened up, and it was a multivalent world. It maybe wasn't yet multicultural. There were no women at Columbia. There were very few Asian Americans. It was still a white world predominantly, but it was a world full of diverse experience. And to me, it was a world also that was unfamiliar to me in many ways with the tradition that I had gone through. And I fell in love with that world.
Well, that seems like a nice place to end the discussion. We end on a clarion call for the importance of college and.
I didn't read your poem. I did. That's okay.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.